Well, first of all, hi.
Hi.
Hello. So last week, I just want to mention right off the top, if you are seeing this now instead of listening to it, just apologies to everybody for not getting the video up. My computer crashed while exporting the video, and I had to do a time machine reset on my computer, which wiped it out. So the podcast was saved, but the video was lost, which is annoying.
Nobody's here for the video.
Everybody's here for the video. People like to
Well,
watch us. Hundreds of people watch the video.
maybe me, but
Media. A bad week in the media.
this is something that we've been warning about for years, but you do get the impression that say that the patient is terminal, Jack, and the family has started to gather around to understand that grandma not coming back. You know what I mean?
I was trying to remember who it was. Was it Oscar Wilde who was asked how did he go bankrupt, and he said slowly at first, then suddenly.
We're in the suddenly phase of that.
So a couple of items this week. The Athletic, which focuses on sports journalism, laid off a series of their reporters this week, including my friend Sean Fitzgerald, which sucks. Scott Stinson, also covering the sports beat, also my buddy at the National Post. He's been, at Post Media, he's been let go. I don't know if that's part of a broader package or if that's I don't know what's up with that, but Scott's gone. The big news was Bell. Many positions being eliminated across the company, including quite a few in the media division and whole radio stations.
I think, yeah.
Pardon me?
1,300.
I don't know how many of those were in the media division, but that
okay.
was the big number. But 6 radio stations have been shut down effective immediately. 3 others are to be sold, apparently, pending CRTC approval. And this is just following up on what we've seen in recent months where Quebecor and Post Media have both done big company-wide layoffs.
Has Post Media actually done their layoffs? Because remember they announced that they were going to reduce their workforce by 11%, but then they just never got around to it.
I think that's a matter of union negotiations. I don't know, but I do believe that has been occurring.
Okay, so that's
I don't know if it's complete, but I think it's started. That's a guess, though. That's just me. I'm off the Post Media group chats.
Yeah.
But that's my understanding. And the other one has not currently resulted in layoffs, but Chorus Entertainment, which is the parent company of Global and a series of radio stations across the country, is in some financial peril. The Toronto Star has not recently done anything, but you and I have both been reading recently the ownership group at the Toronto Star changed, and that let us have a bit of a peek at the financials of the Star, and they were pretty bleak. And what really jumped out at me this week, really, the red flashing signal we can't ignore. 2 colleges in Ontario have suspended their journalism programs. Mohawk College has a 3-year journalism program that it has now suspended. The 2nd and 3rd year kids who are already enrolled, they will complete the program, but the 1st year admissions is done. There will be no more to come. There's been some talk about possibly retooling it into some other content creation format, but we'll see. And Loyalist College has suspended its radio broadcasting program. The party's over and the bar owners flipping the lights on and off for all those stragglers who are still sitting on the at the booths hours after the last call. Party's over. Journalism, as we've known it in the 20th century, has been in a state of decline for 20 years, and it's not dead yet, but this is awfully more dead than it was even 6 months ago.
Yeah, there's never going to be one final thing, right? This is pretty. Yeah. So essentially what we think is happening is what we warned people was going to happen a couple of years ago with the Lisa LaFlamme circumstance, which is that amid everybody talking about Lisa LaFlamme's hair, the signal that people seemed to be missing here was that Bell was exiting journalism. And that was actually the go-to here. Interestingly, with the LaFlamme stuff, it looks like Melling, who was one of the corporate execs who was the brainchild behind that particular letting go of, he's now gone at Bell. I don't know whether or not what to read into that. That could just very well be the expected life cycle of the Hatchet Man coming to its natural close, in which case He
Yeah, the
would have
hatchet
known.
mans don't get the gold watch
Yeah,
independent.
exactly. They do their thing. They last a few years, then they take their severance, and then they leave. And that's the unstated, and sometimes it's explicitly stated, premise of their job. So I don't read Melling's excellent as a good or a bad thing. I think that it's entirely possible that he's just done his job.
The
And also
bookend on the Lisa LaFlamme story, though.
the book of the Plum story. I
Because
mean,
Rosa Wong, her producer, is also gone now.
also gone.
So kind of the two other personalities that were orbiting the Lisa LaFlamme story, they're both gone.
And also, we should be blunt in our assessment here. We do think that Bell is going to go to zero on the journalism file. It's
They're
just
doing
a matter
it.
of
Like, it's gradual, but yeah.
Yeah.
And you know what? We said as much in our dispatch. I don't remember exactly when the LaFlamme situation was. A whole shitload of stuff has happened since. But we wrote a dispatch in 2021 specifically, and it wasn't about LaFlamme yet that I can recall. It was actually about the shutdown of radio newsrooms at CJAD 800 and News Talk 1010. CJAD is in Montreal, and News Talk 1010, the old CFRB, is in Toronto. And just disclosure, Jen, I used to host a show at CJAD, and I'm still a freelancer at the RB in Toronto. They zeroed out their radio newsrooms and basically said, we're going to have consolidated Bell Media television first reporting teams in Toronto and Montreal. And you can either just rip the audio out of their video files, or maybe if you're lucky, you get the TV reporter on the phone for like a 5-minute radio hit if there's like a big shooting downtown or something.
Yeah.
But you and I read the writing on the wall, I think very correctly, back in 2021. If Bell has decided that the most cost-efficient form of news production, which is radio reporting, because like you don't need huge studios. You don't like one person at the scene with a tape recorder and a phone, which is actually, you don't even need the tape recorder, Mark, because your phone will do it. That's a radio reporter.
Yeah.
Radio is incredibly cost efficient in terms of like the audience it can reach. And in the two largest cities in the country, Bell went,
Literally not worth the trouble. Now, I think that the other thing that I would observe in all of this is that the moral and ethical side of what Bell is doing is particularly egregious, because Bell is not like Post Media or The Athletic. Bell's a profitable company. Bell is a grossly profitable company. Bell makes in excess of $3 billion of profit last year. And part of the reason why it is a grossly profitable company is that essentially it has been granted a certain oligarchic status in this country, like the other telecom companies. So I think that perhaps the unstated premise of that status was that, look, we will give you this license to print extraordinary amounts of money, this policy-based license to print extraordinary amounts of money. And, you're going to throw some of that toward providing a journalism environment in this country. And if Bell is raking the unstated premise of half that arrangement, then I think that we should be having a conversation about whether or not these telecom companies deserve the privileged statuses that they employ. If they're not going to produce some kind of broader social good above and beyond their own profit-seeking capacity, then perhaps they shouldn't be given a privileged opportunity to create profit. And this isn't a revenge. This isn't a keep your newsrooms or else. Bluntly, I think that's done. Like I said, the patient's terminal. I think we're past that. But this strikes me as if you actually gave a shit about journalism and you were a member of the federal government. This strikes me as an appropriate place to step in and say, okay, that's fine. You don't want to fund newsrooms across the country. I get that. We get that. There's no value add in that for you. Understood. But guess what? We're going to start opening the marketplace for more competition, and you can't provide exorbitant rates for content services anymore, and creating a more competitive and more innovative environment on the telecom side is where we should really be going, and we should be doing that anyway. But to me, this just heightens the moral argument for that.
I want to throw an idea at you, and I want you to understand that it's not a proposal, because I wouldn't want this to be done. But I remember years ago, very early in my days at the National Post, we were all looking at the trend lines for media, and they were all bad. And one of my colleagues, as a spitball idea, and again, he wasn't even saying it either, but there were all these exotic theories about how to save the media, right? And my buddy just said, put a $5 a month fee on every cable subscriber and every satellite TV subscriber in the country, that the Bell, Rogers, whatever that they collect and provide to the government. I just pulled the stats. 2021, there were just over 8 million TV subscriptions. So you slap a $5 monthly fee on every one of those proposals, and I'm just doing the math. 8
Well,
million.
This is the BBC model.
$500 million. Yeah, exactly. That's $500 million a year. And I'm not proposing that because I don't think people should be forced to subsidize my work. Like I'm kind of preachy about this, but it also it's interesting to me that we have a BBC model, and instead the government was like, let's do C18 and invent an entirely new rationale. Oh, the so-called like value per link, which is bullshit, but they came up with it to go after big tech. And I think you saying a minute ago that like we should revoke some of the special status from Bell. Philosophically, I'd probably agree with that, but this is Canada. We would never do that. Like Bell would unleash an army of lobbyists, and the federal government would surrender without firing a shot. The reason they're going after big tech is because big tech's unpopular, and they're like they don't care.
Big tech's
about
unpopular, and big tech's also largely foreign.
Bingo.
Right. So I mean, like there's no Netflix constituency.
Yeah.
Right. There's no Facebook constituency. These people are from another country.
Think of all the journalism you could subsidize with $500 million a year. And again, I'm not advocating this, but it's the easy path.
The other easy path, bluntly, is to accept that we're in a Canadian environment that's a bit gutless, and to respond to that by saying this is something I've been calling for ages. Instead of creating an entirely new Byzantine funding system, which has the effect of making literally every media outlet dependent in some way on the government for survival.
And big tech.
Yeah, and big tech. Great, super. Why don't you go back to first principles? If your concern here is that there is a declining media ecosystem and structure to support media, to cover the basics, to get the local crime blotter stuff, the local city council, that kind of stuff. If you're concerned that that's not going to be served in this new media environment, because you're right, it won't. The correct answer is to use the levers that you already have at your disposal before you go around creating new ones. And the biggest lever that you have in your disposal is the CBC. If we're dealing with a massive market failure and it's leading to an inability to create quality journalism at a local level, you have the CBC. Like this is where there is an argument for a publicly taxpayer-funded journalism outlet.
I'm pulling up on my phone right now. Right now, I'm going to look at the CBC evening schedule because I want to see what our money.
Yeah.
Right now.
Do it.
So give me a second. I got to find the channel. CBC Toronto.
Sorry, you're going to get some music in the background because we're doing some work in our house. Let's just roll with it. Roll with it.
Let's see. So this is really boring content, I know, for the listeners. It's taking me a while to find it in my app. Here we go.
You're looking for your TV guide here.
See, yeah, exactly. Well, no, I just didn't know what channel CBC was on, which should tell you something. Here we go. Local news, Marketplace at 7:00. Just for Laughs, Gags. Still Standing, which I don't know what that is. Run the Burbs, I don't know what that is. Comedy Festival. The National at 10.
Which is the same comedy festival they've been doing since literally I was a child, I will point out.
Arctic Vets. Coronation Street.
Wow, that's innovative.
So
what an innovative Friday night that you have there in Toronto, Matt. I mean, but here's what you do. So here's how you.
This is why I didn't know what
the
channel was.
Yeah. So here's what you do. You say, look, we need to rethink media in this country. We're undergoing this really painful short to medium term collapse in privately funded media, and they can't afford. I mean, organizations. We've been very candid about this line. We can't afford to do beat reporting. Where would we even we don't make enough money. We can't afford to do, really expensive investigative reporting. I mean, you and I might take that up as a hobby on the side, but we can't do that in a systematic way.
You and I have both traveled to report on stories.
Yeah, we both travel. So there's a growing body of resources there, but it's limited. And so if you are trying to address this limitation in the short and medium term, and you acknowledge that there is a market failure here, and I think there is, then you say, okay, we need to have a mandate review. The mandate review is public. It has to be done through Parliament because that's where the CBC gains its funding and its mandate. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to totally sever news from entertainment, and like news and entertainment are now totally distinct bodies. They narrow the twain shall meet. And I think that their funding mechanisms ought to be different, bluntly.
Don't fund the entertainment.
Yeah, you like I would be perfectly happy with killing the entertainment section and saying like this isn't an appropriate place for taxpayer dollars anymore. Like we have more access to entertainment than we could ever have dreamed of. Like we don't need the CBC to do this anymore. Shift all that funding into news. I would create a trust-based financial arrangement so that the CBC isn't relying on annual money from Parliament every year, but instead is taking its money from some kind of truly independent trust kind of scenario. So you create a $100 billion trust, and then the CBC lives off of the interest of that trust. Is kind of how you do it.
Yep, and then and that way you spare it the Polyev grandstanding.
Yeah, exactly. You're sparing it, but as a deal for that, you have to engage in a really deep-seated mandate review, and that means bluntly tearing apart the division as it stands today and refocusing its efforts to news reporting, local news reporting, underserviced areas. That's where it goes. And then the other thing is you take away the CBC's ability to compete with private. So they can't accept advertising, no more advertising. And the other real culture shift that I would impose on the CBC would, I would be like, your job isn't to compete with your local news environment. Your job is to foster a local news environment. So your job now isn't to outcompete the local post media paper or whatever replaces it. Your job is to make sure that local people who want to do journalism in your community have the resources and the mentorship to do that. So you're hosting mentorship programs for these people. You're teaching them about journalism basics and fundamentals. You're doing technical mentorship. This is how you operate this level of equipment. This is how you do video editing. You're opening up your studios so that people can do podcasting in podcast rooms, which are sound protected rooms, which you will note that we don't have that right now in listening to the background of our pods. You know what I mean? Like you turn these away from being competitive journalism environments and you make them community hubs for journalism. And we already have the real estate infrastructure for the CBC to do that, or to start doing that. And you build this out from there. So maybe the local CBC Calgary or CBC Lethbridge is holding mentorships for a lot of the aspiring journalists in Cardston and Medicine Hat, showing them how to do this stuff and helping support them in creating their own standalone journalism entities. And you will have lots of failures out of that progress. That's fine. But this is a place where a spot where I could see the CBC fostering a journalism environment, an innovative journalism environment in Canada at a local level to help fill the gaps left by the decline of the private industry, and to do so in a way that makes the CBC really conscious of the fact that it is a service to its community. It's not a place where you go to talk down to Canadians from the annex. This entity is there to serve local communities, and local communities especially.
There's something more profound you could also do.
Sure.
Drop all copyright on CBC material.
I was going to say that. Yes, drop all copyright on CBC material. So now anybody who's hooked up into the CBC infrastructure can reprint their news and their audio, their video, and their pictures on their respective websites.
Imagine
those websites are in Canada.
Imagine opening your copy of the Globe and Mail tomorrow, and there's a printed article buried right in there reporting on some interesting story, and at the bottom it says produced by CBC News.
Yeah, this is it, and essentially this has already been done. But I mean, this is what you can do to create an environment where you have somebody covering the local council, and everybody gets access to that information from the local council. Personally, I think the next step is going to be incorporating AI into news gathering. I think that probably the next step is that we're going to be moving into in the next 10 years. Bluntly, is going to be, say somebody wants to start a news outlet in Grand Prairie. Great, super. They've got a little bit of background training. Maybe they've done the CBC workshops, whatever. They're going to pick the 10 stories of the day. They're going to outsource the actual writing of those stories to an AI bot. And then they're going to say, here AI bot, here's the transcript of a 4-hour council meeting. Turn that into a 700-word news story. Boom, there's your content. One person with the aid of a sufficiently advanced AI could make up the equivalent of a 10-person newsroom, right? I don't think the AI is there yet, but I think that that's where this is going. It's not, but that's where this is going. And as long as you have some human oversight deciding what the stories should be and able to fact check those stories, and you have that person have some journalism background, I think that is probably where a lot of these newspapers are going to get sourced and serviced. I mean, the alternative is essentially where people start to get their news is going to be Facebook groups.
Oh, no, yeah. No,
That's
that's already
happening.
happening.
Yeah, that's already happening, right?
I find out about local restaurant openings, closures, car crashes
Yeah.
already on the Leaside community Facebook page.
And so it's not news, so it's not going to get captured under C18, but essentially a lot of local news is going to be supplanted by Facebook groups. So anyway, that's kind of where I see the future going. And I think that the federal government, if it were able to pull its head out of its own ass for 30 seconds and stop listening to lobbyists and to actually go to take this problem down to first principles, would be like the solution and the problem and the solution are already in your grasp. You just have to not be totally goddamn spineless.
That's a pretty tall order.
And be willing to take on the CBC and say, the CBC as it's structured right now is not functioning as it ought to be. Bluntly, the CBC has a lot of ideological priorities that are out of line and out of step with where a lot of Canadians are. And rather than sit around waiting for Poilievre to be elected prime minister, they need to start reevaluating their value and the service that they operate to Canadians. And if you're taxpayer funded, then guess what? Your duty is as a service to your community. Your duty is not to preach to your community. So how can you be of service to your community? That's what I would be doing.
So,
but, hey, shit, what do I know?
I just did something kind of crazy. I had on my desktop, as we're talking right now, I had a bunch of news links that are open. One of them, because we're talking about the state of the media, I had done a quick scan of all media-related news over the last 6 months, looking for layoffs. So at the beginning, I rattled off Quebecor, Post Media, now Bell. One of those tabs was still open. It was a Globe and Mail article on the state of Post Media. I copied, pasted the entire thing, put it into Chat GPT, and I said, please summarize this in 100 words. Want me to read it to you?
Sure, go for it.
This is the Chat GPT summary of a recent Globe and Mail opinion column on the state of Post Media. Post Media, a Canadian media company, faced financial struggles with operating income of $13 million and a $30 million annual debt payment. It received government aid, but still fell short. Post Media's hope lies in the possibility of Google and Facebook subsidizing it under the proposed Online News Act. However, if Google and Facebook stop carrying links to Canadian news stories as they have threatened, Post Media would face further challenges. The company's ownership by U.S. hedge funds since 2010 has led to significant debt and limited control for Canadian shareholders. The hedge fund strategy of cutting costs and selling assets has not been beneficial, and allowing Post Media to decline may be the best course of action.
Everything but the last sentence there was perfectly spot on.
That's creepy.
But you hear what I'm saying? How like in the next 5 to 10, if
a 4-hour city council meeting,
mm-hmm.
Give me 800 words summarizing.
People are like, well, we don't, the current model as it stands isn't going to support somebody treating city council as a beat. And I'm like, yes, that's right. But in the very, very near future, you're not going to need someone to treat that as a beat. You're going to be able to summarize every city council meeting in the entire country with 2 people in Chat GPT, feeding that information into a wire service.
Yeah, feed it one of my own columns.
Yeah, well, let's not go into that because we've got other things to talk about. But
it's like the cool point,
though. But what I'm saying, and I actually don't think that that's even necessarily a bad sign, because that would still be a model that would support human journalists and human journalistic jobs. But human journalists doing like basically increasing their productivity by 1,000 or more %, right? Which isn't necessarily even onerous. Saying like you wouldn't necessarily have a worse work day than previously. In fact, your workday would probably be easier because all you'd have to do is go and look at these 800 summary things and make sure they're more or less accurate.
Yeah, but how are you going to do that without doing the 4-hour?
Well, you just you say you look at what the summary is, you make sure it reads right, and then you double check the quotes against with Control Alt find.
I think some of the bigger. I wonder, Jen, if we should almost take a minute here. Oh, by the way, the Chat GPT summary of one of my columns is horrifyingly accurate. Yes. So I think we should take a step back, and I think we should explain to the listeners and the viewers why this is happening. And let's not spend half an hour on this, because you and I could talk about this for a long time.
Yes.
Over the course of the 20th century, there was a bargain between advertisers and journalism. And the idea was people are always interested in the news. They want to know what's happening in their community. And they're also interested in things like crossword puzzles, scores. Back in the day, I remember when my dad would read the paper, there's page after page of TV guide stuff or stock tickers from yesterday's close. People are interested in that sort of thing. So people wanted to read the newspaper. It was a place where a lot of eyeballs gathered in one place. The same general rule applied for television and for radio. It was a lot of people wanted to watch TV. A lot of people wanted to listen to the radio. So since there were audiences there, advertisers would be like, hey, we want to reach those audiences. So we'll put a page of advertisements in your newspaper. We'll have a classified section for people who want to kind of do a meet and match. I have a bike that I want to sell. Jen, you're looking for a bike. I post a classified ad in the paper. It costs me $10. You find my bike. The paper makes $10 on the transaction. This, or radio listeners, every couple of minutes, 5 great songs or 10 minutes of news followed by 2 minutes from our commercial sponsors. Same on television. That model has been destroyed by the internet. And that's simply because the internet is a much more efficient way of reaching much more targeted audiences. So a newspaper's demographic profile of me would be university educated 40-year-old Caucasian married male. Facebook knows what foods I like, what movies I like, what music I'm into, what size shoes I wear. They know who my friends are. They know what stories I click on to read. They know what stuff I never click on to read. So a big newspaper would probably have 10 data points to understand me from a demographic perspective. Facebook probably has 1,000. It is so much cheaper to advertise online. It is so much easier to spend less money to reach exactly the customers you're looking for. You're not just looking for 40-year-old university educated white men who are married with kids. You want 40-year-old educated white men married with kids who are into classical music, motorcycles,
and Star Trek.
And well, I'm not on any of those things, but like you can hyper specify exactly who you're advertising to, and it's a way more efficient process. So the newspapers, they can't compete. The radio stations can't compete.
And the downside is that a lot of the big tech organizations, social media, don't provide the positive externalities of journalism.
No, they don't.
They're providing a positive service in exchange for these revenue funds, but they're not providing, fact-checked information.
Yep. So
that's what we're left with. Right?
There's an entire industry of journalism, and there's an entire industry of advertisers who need to find audiences to present their advertisements to. And for the 20th century, these two things were out of mutual necessity joined at the hip. The marketing and the advertising guys do not need journalism anymore. They have found something that is better.
Well, and this also explains the underlying psychological logic of C18, because again, C18 has been pushed by old school newspaper types who've joined a lobby, who want to preserve their status quo institutions, which is understandable. And part of it it's not just money based. I mean, there is an understanding that a lot of these institutions serve a deeper public good, and that's good. But they want to go after Facebook and Google in particular, because those are the people who basically stole their markets.
Yeah, it's punitive.
Yeah, it's punitive. It's like, no, fuck you. You stole our classified advertising, so now we're going to make you pay for it. Like that's part of the logic of C18 that went into this. There's long been
unstated, but yeah,
it's unstated. So this is the logic of newspaper publishers. I remember 10, 15 years ago hearing newspaper publishers be like, Google's stealing our news. Like, and they genuinely think that Google is stealing their news. Like, they genuinely believe that because Google was aggregating their news content on Google News without appreciating that what Google was actually doing was massively expanding the reach of your news.
Go visit the Calgary Herald page. Go check out the National Post.
And they were also divorcing the relationship of the reader to the actual outlet itself. So the reader no longer had that kind of relationship with the overall newspaper, but were rather treating news articles as a piecemeal buffet kind of scenario.
Browse the grazers. It was instead of having the newspaper that gets delivered to your house every day, or you always watch the 6 o'clock news on the same channel with the same anchors that you've known that are in your homes for an hour a day. You have very well-read people who get up in the morning, look at an aggregator and go, these following 10 articles are interesting, and what you have is Toronto Star, Globe and Mail, CBC, National Post, BBC, New York Times, Al Jazeera. You read 10 totally different articles that were all presented to you in the same place from 10 outlets, and you're not brand loyal to any of them.
Well, and then the other thing is that this, ironically, is despite the fact that people very rightly trash us terrible, evil pundits and columnists for being parasitic to the system. But if you want to see where people do develop that loyalty, it's not to the brands anymore, it's to the individual people. So people will have brand loyalty to you and me as individuals and individual writers, and they'll follow us across different platforms, but they don't necessarily have brand loyalty to the platform. So columnists, ironically, in this environment, become hugely more important to the brand, because they need those sort of marquee individuals for their readers to develop a human relationship and a human sort of sense of loyalty and connection to, because they no longer, well, they do still, but they have a decreasing level of that connection to the brand as a whole.
I want to follow up on that, Jen, just by mentioning, and again, this is for the benefit of the listeners and the viewers. One of the things we're often asked, why is there so much opinion as opposed to reporting? And it's because opinion is cheap. And let me tell you what I mean by that, because I'm not devaluing the work that you or I or others do.
You can totally devalue the work that we do.
No. I think a lot of the work we do is important. Let me say I have $60,000, hypothetically, $60,000 that I'm going to spend to create content. I can spend it on one reporter, pay him $60,000 a year. And because you don't file every day, because, not every story ends up working out. Sometimes you can't get it done, or that takes 2 days to do, or the story just falls through. Let's assume about a 2/3 success rate for that reporter. He can file 3 times a week, thereabouts. Or I can get 6 columnists, pay them each $200 per column, and I get 6 days worth of content for the same money. It is a more efficient way to get 800 words worth of content when you're paying opinion, as opposed to paying for a reporter to do it. The same logic applies at a radio panel or a television panel, right? Instead of paying a full-time salary of a reporter who's going to go break a story, you pay 3 or 4 people $50 each to pop on your TV panel and talk about what someone else already reported on. It's a lot cheaper that way. You get much bigger bang for the buck. This is why the line is opinion-led. It is what we could do first.
We have no money. We literally started this outlet up with $600.
Yeah.
That's it. And that's what it cost us to get our trademark situation sorted.
Yep.
Like that's literally it. There's
now that we're a going concern, there are costs.
Yes,
but
now there
startup
are
costs were $600.
Our startup costs were $600. Like most startups have failed in the journalism sector, but they start up with a couple $1 million of VC capital.
Yeah.
And they massively try to expand that by, first thing they always do is spend a lot of money on reporters and investigative journalists. And they start with big, we're so great. We're going to change the journalism, blah, blah. 3 years later, they're bankrupt.
Because they spend out the original money and they
overexpand in order to compete in the marketplace. They do 2 or 3 years of great fucking work. I mean, BuzzFeed News is a classic example of this. They do a couple of years of fantastic work and then realize that they can't support the revenue on that work alone. Doesn't pay the bills. So that's why we're over dependent on opinion. I would like to change that. I would like us to make us more reportorial. I would like us to do some investigative stuff, but it's not going to be comprehensive. Neither you are in the illusion that we're going to be creating a comprehensive reportorial outlet that's able to compete with the Globe and Mail. That's not feasible. We're always going to be a niche outlet. I mean, unless somebody wants to hand us a few $1 million in VC money, then we might very well be no strings attached. We might be the exception. Who knows? Anyway, also another thing, Peter Menzies just tweeted me something, and this was in response to my point about Bell being an oligopoly and having an unstated premise to spend some of their profits on journalism. Peter responded, "It's a condition of their license. It's transactional. They agree to. It's written down. It's been less than 12 months since the CRTC renewed their licenses. I am not aware of that, so I will have to look into that." But he's saying it's not even an unstated premise.
What they'll come up with?
Literally, their broadcast license is predicated on the concept that they are going to devote some of that money to journalism.
Yeah,
so I'll look into that. I'm sure they'll find a way to wheedle out of it.
Legally, there will be 3 interns left working for CTV.
Right. Yeah. That's right.
Like that's what
that's how they're going to do it. That's how they're
one
going to do it.
temp retired editor overseeing 3 summer interns. That will be what becomes of CTV.
Yeah.
They will,
and that also explains why they just haven't shut it down in its entirety yet.
They will put exactly as much resources as they think they can get away with into journalism in order to maintain their privileged position. And also, even if they choose to back out, the government won't take on Bell.
No, but I mean, like this is also one of those things that, again, I'll bring it full circle here. This is where I think that this is so frustrating, where the government is creating these entirely Byzantine structures, when all they have to do is be like, no, we're not going to renew your license. Like you actually need to devote significant resources to it. And if you don't, we'll pull your license. Like they actually have
or we'll just let American telecoms come compete.
Or we'll let American telecoms come compete. Exactly. Like they actually want to play hardball. They have the leverage to do it. They just don't. They don't have the leverage. They don't have the balls to do it. And they would rather just go after Facebook because Facebook's a big meanie head.
I think, as I was saying to you online earlier, what we have to understand about Bill C-18 is that it is not intended to save journalism. What it is intended to do is to prevent journalism from literally collapsing in this country, because that would be bad press for the government. So they've come up with some stupid kind of way where they get to kind of, okay, so we're going to have to stop this stuff from outright collapsing, but along the way, we'll take a pot shot at Facebook, which is great because we don't like them. But the purpose is not to reinvigorate a healthy news environment. It's to just kick the final death down far enough the road that it's the next government's problem.
See, I'm actually more optimistic and more cynical. I think the motivations are a bit more complicated than that. I think I don't think that they're really worried about the bad press they're going to get if Postmedia collapses. I don't think Postmedia is that popular. What I do think they are looking at is they're looking at an increasingly atomized information environment where the populace is more and more polarized, and disinformation and misinformation are rampant. And if they allow these status quo journalism outlets to collapse, what replaces them? What replaces them is True North and the Rebel and the Tyee and the National Observer, and a fuller, just such a deepening of that polarization and that divide among the electorate that they're genuinely fearful. Yeah, they're genuinely fearful that in that environment they have a population that becomes essentially ungovernable, or at the very least uncommunicable with them. Right? I think that's actually part of it.
They have the CBC.
They have the CBC, but they haven't thought about that. Like they literally haven't thought about that. Like I think that's actually the issue.
Even the CBC as it is now would suffice to serve your cynical theory.
Potentially, but then you add in the fact that if we can make these people, if we can get these people a good deal with Facebook, they're going to be awfully nice to us. They're going to be awfully beholden to us. Part of it really is just that, like, not only are we afraid of what will happen in the post mainstream media market, like just what happens to a population, what happens to the governability of a population without that kind of shared information network, that kind of shared consensus reality. That is genuine fear here. But in addition, if they can cut these organizations a deal that makes them a little more beholden to us, then that's just icing on the cake. And hey, and you're quite right. If they can fuck over big tech, great. But they're not looking at the problem from first principles. That's my issue with it.
Oh yeah, don't bingo. Yeah, and yeah, you're exactly right. Because if this was actually about saving and supporting journalism, there are much easier, more direct, less convoluted ways to do that.
I mean, for fuck's sakes, they would just tax and spend. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I would disagree with that as on the same philosophical grounds. But it would be far less complicated to simply tax big tech and then reallocate the money. Like that would be a less complicated mechanism than what they're doing right now.
I think something we should do before we move on to a couple of other topics is, you and I have been talking about this in sort of grand strategic terms for however long we've been talking. I don't know if we've ever actually just underlined the explicit point. We kind of touched on it a bit at the beginning. What we're looking at here is the end.
Yes.
And, my entire career, when I joined the National Post, and that was like 2007, 2008, I don't remember exactly when that was, but it was a while ago. And I'd been a freelancer before that. The attitude of everybody was, hey, come on in, kid. You're going to have a great time. You're going to make some good contacts. You're going to get a really cool line on your resume. And when this whole place goes bust in 2 years, you'll go on to the next thing, but you'll have this really great experience. There's been, and probably your entire career has same trajectory, right? No job you've ever started have you had any faith that you were going to get the clock and the gold watch and the pension at the
Oh
end
no,
of
no,
it.
I've literally been to more funerals than retirement parties in this industry.
Yeah.
That's literally true.
And I think that has led us to become a little bit habitualized into the, oh yeah, it's been dying forever, it'll never really die because my whole career it's been dying. No, it may really die. And what we're seeing now is radio stations not cutting back, closing. We're seeing newspapers, particularly in small markets, not cutting back, closing. We are seeing the possibility, I would say, with Post Media first, but I would Torstar not necessarily far behind, of those papers closing. All of them just shutting down one day, or maybe you sell off the brands for parts. When, to me, the really interesting data signal this week was not the layoffs, it was the colleges. Of
Well,
just
I mean,
going,
the fact that the colleges were still running journalism programs in and itself was borderline unethical. And in fact, I wouldn't even call it borderline. You know, even Ryerson and Carleton, which are the top tier journalism schools, I mean, what percentage of those kids go on to have jobs in journalism? It's an absolute,
it's misleading.
it's misleading. You
I
know,
got asked to go to Ryerson years ago and talk to a class of first year kids. And there were like 30 of them. And I said, hey, raise your hand if you actually have any expectation of working in journalism as a career. And like every hand went up. I'm like, there's about 30 of you here. I said, my guess is that 4 of you will find journalism jobs. 2 of you will wash out in the first year. 1 of you will be laid off in your 40s, and 1 of you will make it to retirement. I was not asked back.
Yeah, even that's optimistic. I mean, bluntly, like they're not being realistic. They're not being realistic with the kids who are going into journalism. I mean, they weren't realistic with my generation. They're certainly not being realistic with them now. They're being you were being trained for a communications
job, public relations,
or maybe even potentially a technical job. Like there's lots of interesting behind the scenes technical stuff that you can be trained to do.
Oh yeah, video editing, sound recording,
that kind of stuff, and those are good skill sets to have. So I mean, if you're going for that perspective,
we're
get
lose
your technical skills. Yes,
so
we're gonna get this. Yeah.
So this is interesting, but as I think you and the listeners know, I do host a radio show on Sirius XM every weekday, 10 to 12 Eastern, Sirius XM, channel 167. One of the known problems in the industry is a shortage of trained technical people. Yeah. And the industry's gotten smaller. A lot of the people who've done it have retired. There's enough right now to get by. But the Loyalist College program that's shutting down, a lot of those guys, they would have been a pipeline of actual tech heads who could run the broadcast industry. So we're going to run into shortages of those guys. Let's move on, with the exception of one thing. You and I are both bad at being shameless self-promoters. We talk off the air sometimes about how we need to be more shameless. You and I hate this part of the job. We're not natural salespeople. But let me say something explicit now, and I hate doing this. The line going back to when we started this thing almost 3 years ago was always a 3-step plan. The first step was to get it running so that it was viable and could pay its own bills, and that Jen and I could earn side gig income off of it. Part-time, just a little bit of extra money coming in. We have accomplished that. Step 2 of the 3-step plan was to grow the line to the point where not only is it self-sustaining in its current form, but that Jen and I could make a full-time income off of that. We're not there yet. We're probably about half of the way between step 1 and step 2. Step 3, look, if we accomplish step 2, you and I have succeeded.
Yeah.
Like that would be awesome. Step 3 would be you and I building this thing to the point where we can make full-time wages on this. We become uncancelable. We're not worried about losing freelance gigs or having to scrape together other things. And there's enough money left over that we can do other things. Hire people to do reporting, hire news editors, generate more audio-visual content. This is purely a money play. Folks, if you're listening to us right now, and if you're watching, and if you have not subscribed, this is why we are asking you to subscribe. And we would like you to do that before the lights go out. It's bad. It's the journalism model of the 20th century is over, and it's accelerating in its dive. if there aren't some adults left in the industry, if they all go take comms jobs, the accumulated skill set of generations will be lost in 10 years. Someone has to survive this. And it's very possible, hypothetically, conservatives win the next election, they defund the CBC, and they scrap all the journalism support programs. And I'm not even necessarily opposed to that as policies, but you have to know what that would do to the industry.
The actual the real loss here is actually in the institutional knowledge. And it's the institutional knowledge. So understanding, by institution we mean understanding the history of the people involved in the in what you're keeping, who you're keeping to account. So if I've been in Alberta for 10 years, I've got a pretty good understanding of the players out here now. I know who runs what, how the factions work, all that kind of stuff. You know, you take me out, you replace me with someone half the wage with 2 or 3 years experience, all that institutional knowledge is just gone. But also it's the institutional knowledge of how to do journalism, just the technical skill sets, what's on, what's legit, what's not legit. It takes time to develop, for lack of a better term, the instinct for bullshit. That takes experience and time. And every time we lose someone in their 50s and 60s from this industry, we lose really genuinely invaluable knowledge that we can't replace with somebody whom we're paying $40,000 a year to churn out hashtag content, right? So we're hoping to be among the survivors, the last rats in the barrel.
Yeah, and we hope that one day there are better times, and that there's some new model that we figure out, and people we've worked with here benefit from the experience and become a new generation. But we got to survive that dark age in between, folks. We're not good at this part of it, but if you have not subscribed yet, and if you can, please do, because everything you've come to expect from journalism over the 20th century is going to be gone, I'd say, in 5 or 10 years tops. It might be 2 years.
I think that's even optimistic. But on that note, we have been rambling on quite a lot. We do
want
have
to
a couple
wrap
other
it?
subject. Let's just wrap it, because we have other subjects that we want to talk about, but you will get those in the dispatch.
Yeah.
So
we'll talk about the latest shit shows in Ottawa. We'll talk about
the weird Alberta Facebook censorship claims.
We have one coming in also about Canada being a laggard at NATO. So we're going to have a pretty meaty written dispatch. But no, let's call it here. Let's
call it here. I think that's a long dispatch. I think that's a lot for a lot of people to eat up. And also I think the bulk of our dispatch is definitely going to be on the media stuff, because it does feel like we've crossed the Rubicon on this stuff.
What's amazing to me is how many other journalists just talking this week in group chats and text messages. I think everybody I've talked to this week felt the change. Like this week has felt different. Like it's one thing to basically go, we're trimming this operation down to the bone. It's another thing to say we're shutting it down. And I think what's becoming just increasingly clear is that the companies that have been bankrolling this to date either can't, in the case of a company like Post Media, or in the case of a company like Bell, they've decided they no longer wish to. Okay. Like, we need to be realists, you and I as individuals, but also our listeners and our viewers. We don't have the luxury of denial about what's happening right now. And it is happening right now, and it could happen pretty quickly. What are rising interest rates alone going to do to Chorus, to Bell, to Post Media, to Torstar? 30 years to get here, the last 10 rock bottom interest rates, and all of a sudden interest rates are 5%. How many of these companies are making payroll every month using a revolving line of credit? What's that cost them now?
Yep, and they're not taking on, we're now firmly into the payday money loan line of credit rates for these guys. These guys are not getting prime plus one. Let's just say it that way.
Save journalism if you can, folks.